Hello all, this is Dr. Fields, and I wanted to welcome you to our first official week of class of General Psych. And this first presentation is going to be all about just introducing you to the essentials of psychology. And so if you have questions after this presentation, that's great. I want you to write those down. We will certainly talk about those when we meet in person. And so today we are going to cover several topics. The agenda is going to be roots and subfields of psychology, critical thinking and scientific methods. We're going to also address benefits and risks of studying psychology. We're going to explore how the Christian faith and psychology relate. We're going to also look at the biopsychosocial approach, and we're going to conclude with a little discussion about sleep and dreams. And so, what is psychology? Well, psychology is essentially the study of how the mind and mental processes and behavior intertwine and essentially how we behave, essentially, is what we study as psychologists. And again, the goal is to understand more about how we feel, how we think, and ultimately how that relates into actions in the real world. It's important to keep in mind that things are always impacting how we are thinking, our minds, and our behaviors, including what's going on in our environments and also what's going on in society. And so psychologists have a really cool job because we look to understand behavior by three simple methods. We look to observe people in their environments. We look to conduct experiments with folks that are ethical. And from experiments, we get data that we can analyze that helps us to make decisions. And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Roots of psychology. Psychology goes back a long time. As we think about the roots, we want to think about philosophy, which is a part of psychology. And essentially, that's the thinking part, and biology, which is also a part, and that's essentially the body part. Philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, posed a lot of questions about the mind. Um, Wilhelm Wundt was the first psychologist that developed the first psychology lab in 1879. Also, you may have heard of some of these individuals, but some key figures in the psychology field are Sigmund Freud. Is well known for psychoanalysis, and John B. Watson is also well known for behaviorism. Early schools of thought in psychology are known as structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis. And something that's really important to know, there are Christian psychologists. Some of the well-known Christian psychologists are Adams. He developed neurothic counseling, and Clive Naramore is the founder of the Rosemead School of Psychology. And so a little bit more on structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis. Structuralism essentially is how we is essentially learning more about how sensations, how your mental images and feelings, how those combine, and they create a individual's lived experience. Whereas a little bit differently, functionalism is about how the mind helps us to interact in our environments, how the mind helps us to make decisions. And then another key component, another school of thought in psychology is psychoanalysis, and that deals with the unconscious mind and how the unconscious mind can influence our conscious thoughts. And so as we think about just different areas of psychology, there are a lot of subfields. We've got clinical and counseling psychology, which is focused on helping people to be mentally healthy. And oftentimes, these are our therapists. We've got developmental psychologists, which look at the lifespan of a person from birth to death. We've got biological and neurological psychologists, which really hone in on the relationship between the brain and how the brain impacts our chosen behaviors. Cognitive psychology deals more with memory and problem solving and our ability to conceptualize, think, and learn. Social psychologists study how people interact in groups. Industrial psychologists are focused on how to improve or optimize performance in the workplace. And organizational psychology actually relates to social psychology, but that's really about how people interact and behave in the workplace. And some contemporary issues of psychology that would be good to be aware of, mental health awareness. Essentially, that's understanding how mental health impacts our ability to function in daily life. Neurodiversity is the idea that our brains all develop and work a little bit differently, which is one of the main reasons why people do things differently, because we think about tasks differently. Another section is thinking about how technology impacts behavior. From this contemporary issue, I often think about the impact of social media and how it has been designed to be addictive, and then also how addictive social media impacts our mental health, which is really important to think about. Also, cultural influences, because it's really important for our theories related to psychology to take into consideration the diversity of people that live on this earth, the different people groups. And so it's important to think about how cultural influences impact psychology. And last but not least is ethics and privacy. That deals more with research, and how we engage in ethical research, how we understand people in the right ways, and also for people that choose to participate in research, how we maintain their privacy, which essentially means that we don't let the public know who participated in a study or not. And another really good question to really think about is, how do psychologists study behavior? Well, we use something called the scientific method. Hopefully, this is not your first time seeing this, but if it is, it's okay, because it's not hard to understand or grasp. First and foremost, we ask a question. Then based on that question, we conduct background research. After that background research is conducted, we will develop our hypotheses, which is an educated guess of what we are observing in the real world. We will then test the hypotheses. In the process of testing the hypotheses, we're collecting data, and that data allows us to assess if our original hypothesis is right or wrong. And then based on that data in our analysis, we can develop the conclusions, and then we can also share our results with the general public. And that's the general model of how psychologists understand human behavior. And another important question to think about is how psychologists ask and answer questions. Well, we use critical thinking. We question, we question assumptions, we evaluate evidence. We use the scientific method, which I just talked about. We also will use tools like surveys or experiments, case studies, and observations of the real world. Also, we are very descriptive. Psychology relates to just observing behavior, particularly of people in their natural environment, because that's where you can see how people truly function. Also, we deal a lot with correlation. That is identifying relationships that happen in the real world. And last thing, we conduct experiments sometimes to help us understand what is going on in relation to the mind and how that impacts human behavior. And so benefits of psychology. Psychology helps us to understand ourselves better. It also helps us to improve communication and the relationships with the people that are around us, whether we're talking about your family, school, community, church. It helps us with relationships in every area. It helps us to be mentally healthy, which actually helps us to be just overall healthy in every aspect of life. And we can do different careers with it. You can engage in counseling, you can be a psychologist in education, you can be a business psychologist, and more. So there's a lot of benefits to studying psychology. But at the same token, there's also some risk to studying psychology. We want to be careful when we're studying behavior, that not every finding applies to every population of people. That's the misrepresentation of findings, because we want to make sure that our findings are true and they're being applied in the right way, which also speaks to ethics. We want to make sure that we are not causing any harm when we are conducting experiments, when we're conducting surveys, and when we're doing interventions. And the last but not least is psychologists want to make sure that theories avoid any bias, because a bias has the ability to um, make it so that theory cannot be applied in the right way. And so, as we think a little bit deeper about the relationship between our Christian faith and psychology, a real question that is good to ask is, how compatible are the two? Well, in our readings for the week, David Powlison said, and this is a really interesting quote that I wanted to read to you all. Bring it on. It is the stuff of life that only faith makes sense of and weighs properly. And so as I think about the Christian faith, I'm reminded of Hebrews 11:1. That is, now faith is assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. So in recapping, psychology studies how the mind, which is invisible, impacts human behavior, which is visible. So essentially, we can't see the mind. We have faith that it exists, but we can see the resulting behavior. And another interesting philosopher, Francis Bacon, said, faith is an essential element of the mind. So before we can understand essentially how the mind impacts human behavior, we have to first understand how faith impacts the mind. And so therefore, as Christians, we might argue that the Christian faith is essential for psychology. And something that I really want to bring your attention to also, science versus religion. We hear about this all the time, especially if you do a lot, or if you know a lot of apologists and different things like that. This is one of the things that we are constantly talking about. But there are some psychological theories that will either challenge or negate or tries to disprove biblical views. Examples, determinism and free will. But essentially, psychology studies human. We can, as Christians, we can study human behavior through a faith-informed lens, and that's one of the ways that we integrate our Christian faith with the study of psychology. And as I talk about that, Hebrews 5:14 comes to mind. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. And so it's really important for us to think about, how we can use our faith-informed lens to apply psychology in a true and ethical way. One approach that is often used in applying psychology is called the biopsychosocial approach, and it is essentially a way to assess a problem that might be going on in someone's life, a holistic way of understanding behavior. And so, for example, we have a question here: how can an individual improve their ability to manage stress? Well, if I was using the biopsychosocial approach to think about that person's stress or stress in their life, I would look at number one, is the stressor coming from anything related to the brain, genetics, or hormones? I would also look at the psyche or the psycho. Are there any thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and personalities? Can any of that the person is expressing to me, can that help me understand more about the stress in their life? And the last piece to this is the social. Do relationships, does their culture, does their environment impact their stress? And essentially, this is just a way for a psychologist to frame what might be going on in that person's life that is causing them to have stress. And speaking of stress, one way to really manage stress is to get good sleep. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And just answer the question, why do we sleep and why do we dream? Well, sleep restores our energy, it repairs our body. These are all essential for helping us to think and to behave in successful, good ways. Sleep stores our memories and supports learning. Also, dreams may guide us in processing our emotions and helping us to solve problems. If you've heard of REM sleep, that is when we have our most vivid dreams. Also, getting enough sleep is really important because it helps to regulate our health. Our physical health helps us to be physically healthy. And so you probably have already heard this, but we really need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And so the conclusion for this presentation, just want to draw your attention to some primary points. Psychology is diverse. It is a wonderful scientific field that explores human behaviors from various avenues. We talked about counseling, we talked about in the business setting, we talked about development. It's across the board. It applies to every walk of life. Psychologists help us to understand ourselves and how we interact in the world. The faith perspective can help us to understand ourselves deeper. It can, if we're using psychology, and if we're using our faith-based lens to study psychology and use psychology, then that's going to be a way for us to go and identify deeper meaning because we believe in the infallible Word of God. So as you think about faith and psychology, they both help us to build empathy. One would argue that the Christian faith is perfect in helping us to understand empathy, but psychology can also do that as well. Faith and psychology challenge us to think critically and make informed decisions. So there's some parallels there as well. And also Christian scholars, as Christian scholars, we can study psychology through the faith-informed lens. Hopefully you have seen that pattern over and over again. And so I'm not going to read through these, but these are questions that we probably will talk about when we meet. Hope you guys enjoyed this first presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Take care. God bless.